The throne room of Valemore Palace was built to inspire fear, and it succeeded magnificently. Massive columns of black marble stretched toward vaulted ceilings, where shadows gathered like living things, and the stone floor was polished to such a shine that those who approached the throne could see their own reflections crawling toward judgment. At the far end of this monument to intimidation sat Theron Ashenheart, the Alpha King, a figure so imposing that even his own council members avoided direct eye contact. His presence was a physical weight in the room, the kind of dominance that made lesser wolves bare their throats instinctively, their bodies responding to a power that transcended mere authority. For 43 years, Theron had ruled Valemore with an iron fist that had never trembled, not once, not even when signing execution orders for those who had served him faithfully for decades. The kingdom prospered under his reign, that much was undeniable, but prosperity had come at a cost measured in fear, blood, and the absolute certainty that mercy was a weakness the Alpha King had burned out of himself long ago. Today, the throne room was unusually crowded. Council members lined the walls, their expensive robes doing nothing to hide the nervous energy that made them shift from foot to foot, like children awaiting punishment. Generals stood at attention, their decorated uniforms pressed to perfection, their eyes fixed on some middle distance that allowed them to appear attentive without actually looking at their king. Court nobles whispered behind jeweled fans and gloved hands, their gossip a constant undercurrent of speculation and rumor. They had all been summoned to witness something, though the exact nature of the spectacle remained unclear. All Theron had told his head of council was that a matter of utmost importance to the kingdom's security would be addressed today, and that attendance was mandatory, given the king's recent paranoia about threats both real and imagined. Nobody had dared to question or decline. If you enjoyed this opening and want to see where this impossible love story takes us, make sure to hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think about Theron so far, because this Alpha King is about to have his entire world shaken to its foundations. The massive doors at the entrance groaned open, their ancient hinges protesting as guards pushed them wide. A hush fell over the assembled crowd, the kind of silence that precedes either revelation or disaster. 6 royal guards entered first, their formation tight and weapons drawn, treating whatever they escorted as both precious cargo and deadly threat. Between them, bound in chains that gleamed with runic inscriptions designed to suppress magical abilities, walked a young man who should not have been able to walk at all. His clothes were torn and stained with blood, both fresh and dried, evidence of a journey that had been neither quick nor kind. His dark hair fell across a face that would have been beautiful if not for the bruises that painted his pale skin in shades of purple and black. But it was his eyes that captured attention, unusual eyes that shifted color depending on the light, sometimes appearing silver, sometimes gold, sometimes an eerie combination of both. Those eyes swept across the throne room with a mixture of defiance and resignation, taking in the opulence, the power, the barely concealed bloodlust of a court that had already decided his fate before knowing his name. Theron leaned forward slightly in his throne, a movement so subtle that most would have missed it, but his council noticed, exchanging glances weighted with concern. The king had not shown genuine interest in anything for months, lost in whatever dark maze his mind wandered through during his increasingly frequent episodes. Now, however, his attention was fixed entirely on the prisoner being dragged toward him, and something flickered across his scarred features, something that might have been recognition, or perhaps confusion. When the guards forced the young man to his knees at the base of the throne, Theron stood, descending the 7 steps that separated ruler from subject, with the measured pace of a predator approaching prey. The court held its collective breath, because they had seen this before. This particular choreography of dominance that usually ended with bloodshed and a body being dragged away. But something was different this time. Something none of them could quite identify. An electric tension in the air that made the wolves among them restless and the humans among them nervous. Commander Draven, head of the Royal Guard, and one of the few people who could speak directly to the king without invitation, stepped forward with a formal bow, His voice carried the practiced neutrality of someone who had survived decades of service by knowing exactly how to present information without editorializing. He explained that after 3 months of searching the forbidden forests based on intelligence from captured rebels, his elite tracking unit had finally located the settlement that had been harboring magical anomalies, individuals who possessed abilities that defied the natural laws governing werewolf society. The settlement had been small, perhaps 30 individuals total, a mixed group of outcasts, renegades, and those born with gifts that made them targets in the normal world, following the king's standing orders. Regarding magical threats to the kingdom, the settlement had been neutralized, all inhabitants eliminated except for this one. This singular individual who had been specifically requested to be brought back alive for the king's personal examination. Commander Draven's report was clinical, empty of emotion, but the prisoner's reaction was anything but clinical. A shudder ran through his body, chains rattling, and for just a moment, his eyes blazed with that strange golden-silver light. Tears, cutting clean tracks through the dirt on his face before he regained control and forced his expression back to neutral. Theron circled the kneeling figure slowly, his boots clicking against polished stone with metronomic precision, each step a small eternity for those watching. He was known for these silent examinations, these prolonged moments where he studied his enemies or victims, or sometimes both with the detached interest of a scholar examining a particularly fascinating specimen. But those who knew him best, the few who had served him since before the darkness consumed him completely, noticed something unusual in his circling this time. His breathing had changed, becoming slightly irregular, and his hands, usually so controlled, had curled into fists at his sides as though fighting against some impulse he refused to acknowledge. When he finally spoke, his voice was the low rumble of distant thunder, a sound that carried inherent warning to anyone with survival instincts. He asked a single question, direct and sharp as a blade. "What are you?" Not who, but what, as though the prisoner's personhood was secondary to the category of creature he might represent. The assembled court leaned in collectively, hungry for this moment of revelation, for confirmation of whatever monster their paranoid king had been hunting through forests and villages for the better part of a year. The prisoner lifted his head, and when his eyes met Theron's, something passed between them that was visible to everyone present, but understood by no one. It was not submission, not exactly, but neither was it pure defiance. It was the look of someone who had already lost everything, and therefore had nothing left to fear, nothing left to protect, except perhaps a final shred of dignity. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse from screaming or thirst or both, but it carried clearly through the silent throne room, and what he said would later be repeated in whispers throughout the kingdom. He said, "I am what you made inevitable, when you decided that fear was stronger than compassion, when you made survival dependent on hiding anything that made someone different. I am the child of a werewolf mother, who loved a man from the old bloodlines, the ones you declared extinct because their magic frightened you. I am what happens when love refuses to obey your laws about what is possible and what is forbidden. I am Kale, and I am the last of my kind, and you can add my death to the thousands of others you have already collected, because my existence ended the moment your soldiers murdered everyone I ever loved. So execute me or study me or whatever you have planned, but do it quickly, because I am tired of living in a world where being born different is a crime worthy of genocide." The silence that followed this declaration was absolute, the kind of quiet where even breathing seems too loud, where the racing of hearts becomes audible. Theron had frozen mid-step, his body gone rigid, in a way that made his guards tense, hands moving to weapons in preparation for whatever explosion might come. The king's face had gone pale beneath his tan, and something in his eyes, those cold gray eyes that had watched empires burn without flinching, something in them had cracked open just enough to let through a glimpse of the man he had been before grief turned him into a monster. His wolf, the massive primal force that lived beneath his skin, was roaring, pushing against his control with a strength that made his bones ache and his vision blur. It was impossible, completely impossible, but his wolf recognized something in this broken, bleeding prisoner, recognized it with a certainty that transcended logic or law or anything Theron thought he understood about the world. This creature, this abomination that should not exist according to every natural principle governing their kind, this Kale, carried the scent of something his wolf had been howling for in the darkness for 23 years, ever since the night Theron's true mate had died in his arms and taken his sanity with her. Subscribe to this channel if you want to see how this impossible connection develops, because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about fate, destiny, and second chances that come wrapped in the form of someone who should be your enemy. The council members were already muttering among themselves, their voices building from whisper to conversation, demanding that the king follow through with the execution immediately, reminding him of his own laws against magical hybrids, invoking the security of the kingdom and the purity of bloodlines. But Theron was not listening to them, could not hear them over the roaring in his head, the voice of his wolf demanding that he protect, that he claim, that he do something his human mind insisted was insanity, but his primal self recognized as survival. He turned away from Kale abruptly, climbing back to his throne. With movements that were almost robotic, controlled to the point of breaking, when he sat, he did not immediately speak, and the silence stretched until even the boldest council member fell quiet, waiting for their unpredictable king to pronounce judgment. The order, when it came, shocked everyone present and would be debated and dissected for months to come in every corner of Valemore. Theron commanded that the prisoner be taken to the South Tower, the one reserved for guests of particular importance or danger, sometimes both. He was to be given medical attention, clean clothes, food and water, and a room that, while locked and guarded, was more sweet than cell. No one was to harm him, question him, or interact with him without the king's explicit permission. Commander Draven would personally oversee his care and report directly to Theron twice daily on the prisoner's condition. The execution, Theron said in a voice that brooked no argument, was postponed indefinitely pending further investigation into the prisoner's claims and abilities. When the head of the council, a silver-haired alpha named Magnus, who had served 3 kings and survived by knowing when to push and when to retreat, attempted to protest, Theron's response was to simply look at him, really look at him, with eyes that had gone completely black, his wolf too close to the surface. Magnus wisely chose to retreat, bowing his head in submission and falling silent, though his expression promised that this conversation was far from over. As the guards hauled Kyle to his feet, preparing to escort him to his new accommodations, the young man looked back at Theron one final time. There was confusion in his unusual eyes now, mixing with the resignation and grief, because this was not how this was supposed to go. This was not the ending he had prepared himself for during the long journey in chains. For just a moment, their eyes met again, and this time, Theron did not look away, did not hide behind the mask of cruel indifference he had perfected over decades. For just a moment, Kyle saw something that might have been pain, might have been recognition, might have been the beginning of something that would either save or destroy them both. Then the moment passed. The guards were pulling him away, and the throne room erupted into chaos as council members surrounded the king, demanding explanations, invoking laws and precedents, their voices rising in a cacophony of outrage and fear. But Theron heard none of it, his attention fixed on the doorway through which Kale had disappeared, his hand pressed against his chest, as though trying to contain something wild and dangerous that was clawing its way toward the surface. The South Tower had not been used in over a decade, not since Theron's last attempt at maintaining diplomatic relationships with neighboring kingdoms had ended in betrayal and bloodshed. The suite they placed Kyle in was large, far larger than necessary for a single prisoner, with windows that looked out over the palace gardens and the city beyond. The furniture was covered in dust cloths that the servants hastily removed, revealing pieces that had once been beautiful and would be again with proper care. A massive bed dominated one wall, its posts carved with scenes of hunts and victories from Valemore's history. Tapestries depicting the kingdom's founding hung on stone walls, and a fireplace large enough to stand in occupied the far corner, wood already, laid and waiting for flame. It was, in every way, accommodation meant for honored guests, not prisoners awaiting execution, and the disconnect between what Cale expected and what he received was so vast that he found himself laughing, a sound that held no humor whatsoever, only the brittle edge of someone whose understanding of reality had just been fundamentally shattered. The physician who arrived to tend his wounds was an elderly woman named Elena, her hands gnarled with age but steady with competence. Her eyes sharp with intelligence that age had only refined. She worked in silence at first, cleaning cuts that had begun to fester, applying salves to bruises that had spread across Cale's ribs like dark flowers, setting a finger that had been broken and healed wrong during his capture. Her touch was gentle, professional, and Cale found himself relaxing despite every instinct screaming that this was a trap. That kindness from the Alpha King's court was just another form of cruelty, a way to make the eventual execution hurt more by giving him a taste of comfort first. But Elena seemed genuine in her care, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak plainly. She told him that she had been royal physician for 46 years, serving Theron's father before him, watching the young prince grow from an idealistic boy into the hardened king he had become. She had also been there the night Theron's mate died, had held Lyanna's hand as life faded from her eyes, had watched something essential break inside the young king, something that never healed properly, leaving jagged edges that cut everyone who came close. Kyle listened to her words while she worked, his mind struggling to reconcile the monster who had ordered the deaths of everyone he loved with the grief-shattered man Elena described. He asked her why she was telling him this, what possible reason she could have for humanizing the Alpha King to someone who had every reason to hate him. Elena paused in her ministrations, her ancient eyes meeting his unusual ones with something that might have been sympathy, or perhaps warning. She said that she was telling him because she had seen the way Theron looked at him in the throne room, had recognized that particular expression because she had seen it once before, 23 years ago, when a young Alpha Prince first laid eyes on an Omega girl from a minor noble house, and his whole world had tilted on its axis. She said that whatever was happening between Cale and the king was dangerous, possibly catastrophic, but also potentially the only thing that could pull Theron back from the abyss of madness he had been circling for over 2 decades. She warned that the court would see Cale as either threat or opportunity, that there were factions who would try to use him, to manipulate him, to turn whatever connection existed between him and Theron into a weapon. And she advised, in a voice that carried the weight of hard-won wisdom, that Cale should decide quickly what he wanted, survival or revenge, because those paths would diverge soon and he would only get one choice. The first 3 days passed in a strange limbo, where Cale was neither prisoner nor guest, but something undefined in between. Guards stood outside his door, but did not enter unless he requested something. Servants brought meals that were too elaborate, too carefully prepared for someone meant to die, and they refused to meet his eyes, frightened of him, or for him, or perhaps both. He was given books from the palace library, clothes that fit perfectly as though someone had taken his measurements while he slept, and access to a private bathing room where he could finally wash away the blood and dirt that had caked his skin since capture. He tried to read, to sleep, to do anything that might quiet the chaos in his mind, but his thoughts kept returning obsessively to that moment in the throne room, to the way Theron's eyes had changed, to the impossible feeling that something had clicked into place between them, something that defied every logical explanation. His own magical abilities, usually so controlled, were acting strangely, sparking and flickering at random moments, responding to emotions he was trying desperately to suppress. The bond sight, his ability to see the connections between people, the threads of loyalty and love and obligation that tied souls together. That gift was going haywire, showing him glimpses of threads leading away from him, away toward somewhere else in the palace, toward someone else. And that made no sense. No sense at all, because Kyle had never had bonds, had always been separate, different, alone. On the 4th day, Theron came to him. There was no warning, no announcement, just the sound of the door opening, And then the Alpha King stood in the doorway, filling the frame with his presence, his eyes locked on Kale, with an intensity that made breathing difficult. He had come alone, without guards or attendants, a breach of protocol so severe that it would have his security team in fits if they knew. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence heavy with everything that could not be said, everything that should not even be thought. Theron looked different somehow, the mask of cruel indifference slightly cracked, exhaustion evident in the lines around his eyes and the way he held himself, as though his own body had become a burden he was struggling to carry. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked the commanding thunder of the throne room, coming out rough and almost tentative, an uncertainty that seemed wrong coming from a king who had not questioned himself in decades. He asked simply and directly what Kale had done to him, what magic or curse or manipulation had been used. Because Theron could not sleep, could not think, could not exist without feeling the pull toward this tower, toward this room, toward this person who should mean nothing and somehow meant everything. Kale stood slowly from where he had been sitting by the window, his body still aching from injuries not yet fully healed, his strange eyes reflecting firelight as he studied the king who had destroyed his life and was now standing before him looking almost vulnerable. The honest answer would have been that Kale had done nothing, that whatever was happening between them was as unexpected and unwanted for him as it apparently was for Theron. But honesty felt dangerous, felt like giving away power in a game where he had no pieces and did not understand the rules. So instead, he asked his own question, his voice steady despite the trembling he felt inside. He asked if Theron felt any remorse at all for the people his soldiers had slaughtered, for the families torn apart, for the children murdered because they happened to be born with abilities that frightened small minds. He asked if the Alpha King ever lay awake at night thinking about the faces of those he had condemned, or if their deaths were just numbers in reports, statistics that justified his paranoia. He asked because he needed to know if the man standing before him, the man his traitorous body was responding to with warmth that should not exist, if that man was capable of any shred of redemption, or if Kale was being pulled towards something that would only destroy him more completely than death ever could. The question hit Theron like a physical blow, and something shifted in his expression, the defensive walls slamming back into place, his body language returning to that rigid control that allowed no weakness. But before the walls could fully close, Kyle saw it, a flash of agony so profound it took his breath away, and his bond sight activated involuntarily, showing him something impossible, a glimpse of the threads that should have been surrounding Theron, the connections that every person built over a lifetime of relationships and interactions. But there was almost nothing there, just tattered remnants of bonds long dead or abandoned, and one thread, thick and pulsing and completely wrong, that extended from Theron's chest into darkness, a connection to someone or something no longer present, a bond that should have faded with death, but instead had turned into chains that kept the king trapped in grief that never healed. And there, emerging new and fragile and absolutely impossible, was another thread, this one extending from Theron, directly to Kale, glowing with potential, and Kale understood in that instant exactly what his bond sight was showing him, exactly what his wolf and Theron's wolf had recognized from the first moment, and the impossibility of it made him stagger backward, his legs hitting the chair, and nearly collapsing. Comment below what you think Kale should do now that he understands what is happening, because this revelation is about to change everything, and we need to talk about the implications of second chance mates, especially when the first chance ended in tragedy that broke a king. Theron moved forward instinctively when Kale stumbled, his hand reaching out to steady him before conscious thought could intervene. And the moment their skin made contact, both of them gasped at the shock of connection that raced through that touch, electric and undeniable and absolutely terrifying. Theron jerked his hand back as though burned, but the damage was done, the truth impossible to ignore now that they had felt it. The mate bond that should not exist, that violated every known law about how such things worked. Kale was shaking his head, backing away until his shoulders hit the wall, his voice coming out barely above a whisper as he said no. This could not be happening. This was not possible. Mate bonds did not regenerate, did not form twice in one lifetime. Every text, every legend, every fundamental truth about their kind said it was impossible. But Theron was shaking too, his control fracturing visibly, and he said in a voice raw with emotion that he knew it was impossible. But his wolf would not stop howling, would not stop demanding that he claim, protect, keep. And he did not know if this was madness or miracle or punishment for crimes he could not undo. The conversation that followed was brutal in its honesty, both of them too shaken to hide behind pretense or political maneuvering. Kyle demanded to know how he was supposed to feel anything but hatred for someone responsible for so much death, how a mate bond, no matter how impossible its existence, could possibly override the moral obligation to hold Theron accountable for his actions. He said that he had watched people he considered family bleed out in the dirt, had heard their screams as Theron's soldiers set fire to homes with people still trapped inside, and no magical connection could erase those memories or make them somehow acceptable. Theron did not defend himself, did not make excuses, and that almost made it worse, because Kale wanted him to be the monster, needed him to be irredeemable, so that rejecting this bond would be simple. Instead, Theron said quietly that he remembered every name, every face, every execution order he had signed, that they haunted him in ways Kale could not imagine, that he had built an empire of fear because it was the only thing standing between him and the void of grief that wanted to swallow him whole. He said that Lyanna, his first mate, had been the light that made him believe in goodness. And when she died, murdered by rebels who wanted to prove that even the Alpha King could bleed, something in him had died with her. He said that he became the very thing she would have hated because he could not bear to be vulnerable again, could not survive another loss like that, so he made sure that everyone feared him too much to ever get close enough to matter. Kale listened to this confession, heard the pain beneath the words, and hated that it moved him, hated that his Omega instincts were screaming at him to comfort, to soothe, to heal this broken Alpha standing before him. He asked what Theron wanted from him, what the king expected to happen now that they both knew what they were to each other. Theron's answer was not what he expected. The king said he did not know, that he had not planned for this, could not have anticipated that fate or destiny, or whatever cruel force governed their lives, would give him a second chance and make it come in the form of someone who had every reason to despise him. He said that he would not force anything, would not use his power or position to manipulate this situation, that if Kale wanted to reject the bond, Theron would accept it, would even help facilitate it, despite what it might cost him. But he asked, and his voice broke slightly on the words, he asked if there could possibly be a world where they explored what this connection meant, where they tried to understand it before deciding. It was impossible. He said that he did not deserve forgiveness, knew he could never undo the harm he had caused. But maybe, possibly, if Kale was willing, they could find a way forward that honored both the pain of the past and the impossible hope of this present moment. The smart thing, the logical thing, would have been to refuse, to reject this bond and everything it represented. But Kale had never been good at doing the smart thing, had always been cursed with an ability to see beneath surfaces, to understand the complexity hiding under simple categories of good and evil. When he looked at Theron, really looked with all his gifts active, he saw a man destroyed by grief and fear, but also a man capable of change if given reason to try. He saw the Alpha his mate had loved before tragedy broke him, still there beneath decades of scar tissue and defensive cruelty. And he saw, perhaps most importantly, that Theron was genuinely asking, genuinely giving him choice, was not using the mate bond as excuse or justification, but acknowledging that Kale's consent and agency mattered more than biological imperatives. So Kale made a decision that was either the bravest or stupidest thing he had ever done, probably both. He said yes, he would try, but there would be conditions, non-negotiable terms that Theron would have to accept if this was going to be anything more than cosmic joke. He said that Theron would have to truly look at his reign, at the policies and laws that had caused so much suffering, and be willing to change them, to make amends where possible. He said that the king would have to let Kyle see the real him, not the mask he wore for court, and that Theron would have to accept being challenged, being questioned, being held accountable in ways that rulers rarely tolerate. And most importantly, Kale said that if at any point this bond became about control rather than partnership, if Theron fell back into patterns of dominance and fear, Kale would walk away and never look back. Consequences be damned. Theron agreed to the terms without hesitation, and they shook on it. A formal gesture that felt absurdly inadequate for the magnitude of what they were attempting. But it was a start, a first step into territory neither had mapped. The king left shortly after, needing to return before his absence was noted, and sparked rumors neither of them were ready to address. But before he went, he did something unexpected, something that revealed more vulnerability than any words could have. He asked if he could visit again, not as king to prisoner, not as alpha to omega, but as Theron to Kale, two people trying to understand an impossible situation together. And Kale, despite every reason for caution, found himself agreeing, found himself already anticipating the next conversation, the next moment when they might peel back another layer of the armor they both wore. After Theron left, Kale sat by the window watching the sun set over Valemore, his mind spinning with everything that had just transpired, and he wondered if he had just made a deal with someone capable of change, or if he had simply given the devil himself a new way to destroy him. The visits became routine over the following weeks, Theron arriving at odd hours when his schedule allowed, sometimes staying for mere minutes, other times settling in for conversations that lasted hours and left them both mentally exhausted but strangely satisfied. They talked about everything and nothing, carefully navigating around the massive obstacles between them while trying to understand the fundamentals of who they each were. Theron spoke about his childhood, about a father who believed that showing emotion was weakness, about watching his mother fade away from heartbreak after his father took a second wife for political advantage. He talked about meeting Lyanna, about how she had been the first person who saw past his titles and training to the person underneath, about the 3 years they had together before her death, years that even now, decades later, he remembered with perfect clarity. Kale shared his own history, the fragments of it he could bear to voice, about growing up hiding what he was, about a mother who loved him fiercely until fever took her when he was 12, about finding community in the forbidden forests with others who did not fit the normal categories, about learning to use his gifts to help heal, to see truth, to build connections in a world that wanted to destroy anything different. Between these conversations, Kel began to see more of the palace, granted limited freedom to walk certain areas, always accompanied by guards who maintained respectful distance. He saw the opulence built on fear, the way servants moved through halls with heads down, the way nobles positioned themselves in careful hierarchies designed to keep favor and avoid notice. He also began to see cracks in Theron's regime, inefficiencies and cruelties built into systems that had never been questioned, laws that existed only because they had always existed, punishments that far exceeded crimes. His bond sight showed him the web of connections throughout the palace, showed him that most people were not loyal to Theron out of love or respect, but out of terror, and that kind of foundation was fundamentally unstable, waiting for the right push to collapse entirely. He mentioned these observations carefully during their conversations, watching how Theron responded, testing whether the king was truly willing to examine his own choices, or if the promises made in that first vulnerable conversation would evaporate under scrutiny. To his cautious hope, Theron listened, really listened, and sometimes his responses revealed a king who had not been blind to these problems, but who had convinced himself that cruelty was necessary, that fear was the only reliable tool for maintaining order. Make sure you are subscribed, because the next part of this story is going to show you exactly how an Omega, with nothing left to lose, and an Alpha with everything to prove, begin the dangerous work of transforming not just themselves, but an entire kingdom, and the forces that will try to stop them are gathering power even as they speak. The turning point came during a conversation about Kale's magical abilities, which had been carefully demonstrated under controlled conditions for the king's personal observation. Kale had shown how he could see bonds between people, could identify when someone was lying by the way their connections flickered and frayed, could even influence minor aspects of pack bonds to strengthen loyalty or heal rifts between individuals. He had healed a servant's injury that the royal physicians had declared permanent, had identified a spy in Theron's guard by seeing that his bonds led away to another kingdom, had proven again and again that his abilities were real, powerful, and potentially revolutionary. But he had also explained the cost of such power, the way using his gifts left him drained and vulnerable, the headaches that lasted days after major demonstrations, the risk that pushing too hard could burn out his abilities entirely or worse, damage his mind. Theron had listened to all this with intense focus, and then asked the question that revealed he was beginning to understand what Kale actually represented. He asked what would happen if these abilities were not seen as threat, but as gift. What possibilities opened up if werewolf society accepted rather than feared those with magical talents? What a kingdom could become if it protected its unusual members instead of hunting them? The answer to that question became a project they worked on together, carefully and in secret because neither trusted the court's reaction to such radical thinking. They began drafting changes, reforms that would start small and build gradually, revising laws about magical bloodlines, creating protections for those with unusual abilities, establishing processes for appeal and review rather than automatic execution. It was delicate work, requiring them to think strategically about implementation, about how to sell these changes to a council and nobility who benefited from the current system. Kyle brought perspective about the communities that had been driven underground, about what they would need to feel safe enough to emerge. Theron brought knowledge of political realities, of how to navigate entrenched interests and generational prejudices. They argued frequently during these planning sessions, their different perspectives clashing, but the arguments were productive, each pushing the other to think more carefully, to consider angles they might have missed. And through this work, something shifted between them. The mate bond that had been largely suppressed, kept in check by mutual agreement to move slowly. That bond began to strengthen naturally, built not on magical compulsion, but on genuine respect, on shared purpose, on the intimacy that comes from working toward something meaningful together. The court noticed the changes in their king before they understood the cause, noticed that Theron was different in ways both subtle and significant. He was attending council meetings with renewed focus rather than barely concealed disinterest, was asking questions about domestic policy and citizen welfare that he had not bothered with in years, was reviewing old cases and occasionally overturning judgments that had been considered settled. Some council members were pleased by this unexpected engagement, interpreting it as their king finally emerging from the grief madness that had made him increasingly erratic. Others were deeply suspicious, recognizing that engagement meant scrutiny, meant their comfortable arrangements might be disrupted. Commander Magnus in particular watched these developments with growing concern, because he had built considerable power in the vacuum created by Theron's disinterest, and a king who was actually paying attention threatened decades of careful empire building. Magnus began to investigate, to quietly question guards about the South Tower, to piece together the truth that their king was spending alarming amounts of time with the magical hybrid prisoner who should have been executed weeks ago, and that realization set in motion plans that would bring crisis and revelation in equal measure. The confrontation came during a formal council session that Kale had been invited to attend, a development that shocked everyone present since prisoners were never included in governmental proceedings. Theron had presented it as educational, claiming he wanted his council members to witness Kale's abilities firsthand so they could make informed policy decisions rather than acting on prejudice and fear. But Magnus saw through the pretense immediately, recognized this for what it was, the king testing reactions, preparing ground for larger revelations to come. When Kale demonstrated his bond sight by accurately describing the connections between people he had never met, when he identified areas of corruption by seeing where loyalties had been bought rather than earned, when he healed a council member's chronic pain that had resisted all conventional treatment, the reactions split along predictable lines. Some were amazed, seeing potential for these abilities to benefit the kingdom. Others were terrified, recognizing that someone who could see truth through lies represented existential threat to anyone with secrets to hide. Magnus fell firmly in the latter category, and when the demonstration concluded, he rose to speak with voice-dripping practiced outrage. He reminded the council that they had laws against magical hybrids for reasons, that such beings were dangerous, unpredictable, potentially capable of manipulation that could undermine the very foundations of werewolf society. He said that whatever abilities this Kale possessed only proved how dangerous he was, how crucial it was to eliminate such threats before they spread. And then, his eyes locked on Theron. Magnus asked directly why their king was protecting something that should have been destroyed according to his own orders. What possible explanation there could be for this unprecedented favoritism toward an abomination? The word abomination hit Kale like physical blow, all the old wounds of rejection and persecution splitting open fresh. And his control wavered just enough that his bond sight flickered active involuntarily, showing everyone present what only he had been able to see before, the web of connections throughout the room suddenly visible as glowing threads of light. And there, undeniable to anyone with eyes, was the thick golden cord that connected him to Theron, the unmistakable signature of a mate bond, impossible but irrefutable. The throne room erupted into chaos, voices overlapping in shock and accusation and speculation, but Magnus's voice cut through it all, triumphant and vicious as he declared that this explained everything, that their king had been compromised by mate bond to the very thing he should have destroyed, that Theron was no longer capable of ruling objectively, that for the good of the kingdom intervention was necessary. He called for emergency council vote on the king's fitness to rule, a procedure that existed in law but had not been invoked in over 2 centuries, and to Theron's visible shock, several council members immediately signaled support for the motion, enough to meet the minimum required to proceed. Kale understood immediately that this had been planned, that Magnus had been gathering allies and waiting for the perfect moment, and that moment had just arrived gift-wrapped in magical revelation and forbidden bonds. If you are watching this thinking your own life is complicated, just wait, because Theron is about to learn that being an all-powerful king means nothing when your own government decides you are liability, and Kyle is going to have to make choices about how far he is willing to go to protect someone who both saved and destroyed him. The emergency session that followed would have been almost comedic in its formality if the stakes had not been so desperately high, council members citing precedents and procedures while essentially arguing about whether their king should be removed from power. Magnus presented his case with skill honed over decades, painting picture of a once great ruler compromised by magical influence, suggesting that Kale had somehow manipulated the mate bond, or used abilities to cloud Theron's judgment, arguing that recent policy discussions were evidence of thinking completely contrary to everything the king had stood for throughout his reign. Other council members added their voices, some echoing Magnus with varying degrees of conviction, others defending Theron, but in ways that suggested obligation rather than genuine support. Through it all, Theron sat on his throne, and Kale, watching from where guards had frozen him in place, saw something he had never seen before on the Alpha King's face. Genuine fear, not of physical harm, but of losing everything he had built, of being declared unfit, of having power stripped away, not through conquest, but through political maneuvering by those he had trusted to serve. But then Theron stood, and when he spoke, his voice carried the full weight of his alpha. Dominance, the primal power that made every wolf in the room instinctively bare throat in submission, and the chaos quieted instantly. He said that they wanted to question his fitness, wanted to examine his judgment, then examine this, look closely at the kingdom he had built, and ask themselves if it was truly something worth preserving in its current form. He spoke of laws designed more to control than protect, of systems that rewarded cruelty and punished compassion, of decades spent building walls of fear so high that nobody could see the rot festering behind them. He admitted that the mate bond to Kale had indeed changed him, but not through manipulation or magical influence. changed him by showing him what he had become, by giving him reason to look honestly at choices he had made and actions he had taken, and finding himself wanting. He said that Magnus was right about one thing. His priorities were shifting. His thinking was changing. Because he was beginning to understand that true strength was not found in making people fear you, but in giving them reason to follow you willingly. And if the council deemed that made him unfit to rule, if they wanted to remove him for deciding that perhaps genocide against those with magical abilities was wrong, if they wanted to replace him with someone who would maintain the comfortable cruelty of the status quo, then perhaps he was not the leader this kingdom deserved. But neither were they the council worth serving. The speech was either political suicide or masterstroke, impossible to predict which in the moment, and the following silence stretched taut enough to break. Then Elena, the royal physician who rarely attended council sessions, but whose presence today had been specifically requested by Theron, rose from her seat in the observation gallery and asked to be recognized to speak. Magnus tried to deny her, but Theron overruled him, and the elderly woman descended to the council floor with the slow dignity of someone for whom time was a resource to be used carefully. She spoke of serving 4 decades in this palace, of watching good men become hard men because they confused strength with invulnerability, of treating wounds both physical and psychological inflicted by governance that valued order over humanity. She said that she had watched Theron almost destroy himself after Lyanna's death, had seen him build armor so thick that nobody could reach the wounded person inside, and she had wondered if anything would ever break through that defense before he completed his transformation into tyrant history would judge harshly. She said that Kale, whatever else he might be, had done something she thought impossible, had reached that wounded person and offered a reason to heal. And if the council could not see that as miraculous rather than threatening, then perhaps the problem was not their king's fitness, but their own cowardice in face of change. Her words shifted something in the room. Opinion, wavering as those who had supported Magnus primarily out of fear rather than conviction began to reconsider, began to see the motion against Theron for what it actually was. A power grab by a man who wanted control without accountability. Magnus sensed his support crumbling and made a desperate play, calling directly on pack law, specifically the provision that allowed any alpha to challenge for leadership if they believed the current alpha was failing to protect the pack's interests. He formally issued challenge to Theron, combat to determine who would rule Velmor, and by law, the king could not refuse without being deemed forfeit and removed from throne immediately. It was brilliant strategy, because Magnus was known as formidable fighter despite his age, had trained constantly and maintained warrior's condition, while Theron had spent 20 years consumed by paperwork and paranoia, had neglected his combat skills, had allowed his body to carry weight that would slow him in. Serious fight. The council chamber erupted again, some protesting the challenge as improper, others arguing it was Magnus's right. And through it all, Theron stood silent, calculating odds and outcomes, knowing that he could not win this fight through strength alone, but perhaps, possibly, he could win it another way. Theron accepted the challenge, but invoked his right as reigning alpha to set the terms of combat, and the terms he proposed made everyone reconsider what they thought they knew about their king. He said that physical combat proved only who was stronger, not who was wiser or more fit to lead. So the challenge would be decided not by claws and fangs, but by truth, by each of them answering questions about their reign, their decisions, their vision for the kingdom, with Kyle using his abilities to verify honesty. They would stand before the court and before the kingdom, because this challenge would be public, observed by citizen assembly as well as nobles, and they would defend their records and their intentions with transparency they had both avoided for too long. Magnus tried to refuse, arguing that this was not traditional combat, but Theron pointed out that pack law specified the challenged alpha set the terms, and unless Magnus wanted to withdraw his challenge entirely, he would have to agree. Backed into corner by his own gambit, Magnus agreed, but his expression promised that this was far from over, that there would be consequences regardless of outcome. The public trial, because that was effectively what Theron had proposed, was scheduled for 3 days later, giving both sides time to prepare arguments and gather evidence. The announcement spread through Vilemore like wildfire, commoners and nobles alike, stunned by the prospect of their reclusive king submitting himself to public questioning, of accusations and defenses being aired for all to witness. The palace became a whirlwind of activity, Magnus and his supporters working frantically to build their case, compiling lists of Theron's cruelties and failures, gathering testimonies from those harmed by his policies. On Theron's side, the preparation was different, quieter, more introspective, because the king was not gathering evidence to defend himself, but rather preparing to acknowledge everything he had done wrong, to own his failures publicly, and articulate why he deserved a chance to make amends. Kyle worked with him through those 3 days, helping him organize thoughts, challenging him when his instinct toward defensive justification emerged, reminding him that this trial was not about winning, but about honesty, about showing the kingdom who he truly was beneath the crown and armor. The day of the trial arrived with the kind of anticipation that precedes either revolution or revelation. The central square packed with thousands of citizens who had never been given voice in their government before and were almost giddy with the unprecedented access. A platform had been erected with seats for the council, space for Theron and Magnus to stand while questioned, and a position for Kell, where his bond sight would be visible to all when activated. The proceedings began with formality that barely contained the tension underneath. Magnus speaking first because as challenger, tradition gave him opening statement. He spoke eloquently about Theron's reign of terror, citing specific executions, particular cruelties, laws that had destroyed families and communities. He spoke of paranoia that had made the kingdom afraid, of isolation that had cut them off from allies, of a king so lost in grief that he had forgotten his duty was to the living, not the dead. It was damning recitation, made more powerful because all of it was true. Every accusation supported by records, by witnesses, by undeniable evidence. And when Magnus finished, a significant portion of the assembled crowd was nodding agreement, angry at reminder of harms they had tried to forget. Then it was Theron's turn, and he did something nobody expected. He agreed with Magnus about almost everything. He stood before his people without the crown, without the royal regalia, just a man in simple clothes, and he acknowledged every crime Magnus had cited, every cruelty he had authorized, every life he had taken or destroyed through law and order. He did not make excuses, did not blame grief or duty or the burden of crown. He simply owned what he had done, and admitted that for 23 years, he had been terrible king to people who deserved better. But then he did something that changed the entire nature of the trial. He asked the assembled citizens if any of them had never made mistakes, had never acted from fear or pain, had never hurt someone they loved because they were too broken to know better way. He asked if they believed that people were defined solely by their worst moments, or if redemption was possible for anyone willing to do the difficult work of change. He spoke about meeting Kal, about having someone see him truly and still believe he could be better, and he promised that if given the chance, he would spend the rest of his reign proving that belief was not misplaced, dismantling the systems of fear he had built, creating kingdom where difference was celebrated rather than destroyed, where power served people rather than controlling them. Comment below if you think Theron deserves this second chance, because the people of Valemore are about to make a choice that will determine not just who rules, but what kind of kingdom they want to be. The questioning that followed was intense. Both Magnus and Theron subjected to examination about specific decisions, asked to defend or explain choices they had made. Their honesty verified by Kyle, whose bond sight glowed bright enough that everyone could see when connections stayed strong and true, or when they flickered with deception. Magnus was revealed to have enriched himself considerably, through his position, to have covered up crimes by nobles who supported him, to have manipulated situations to increase his own power at expense of the kingdom's welfare. None of it was technically illegal, but the pattern painted picture of someone motivated primarily by self-interest, who spoke eloquently about kingdom's welfare while building personal empire. Theron's questioning was different because he was not trying to hide anything, was answering even the most painful questions with brutal honesty that left him emotionally raw and the audience stunned by the depths of his admission. When asked if he felt remorse for those he had killed, he listed names, dozens of them, people whose faces he saw every night in dreams that never let him rest. When asked why he had not changed sooner, he admitted that he had been afraid, that being cruel was easier than being vulnerable, that he had not wanted to feel anything because feeling meant remembering what he had lost. The trial stretched through the day and into evening, testimony and questioning revealing layers of truth that nobody in Velmore had ever been allowed to see before. And slowly, gradually, something shifted in the crowd, anger and betrayal transforming into something more complex, a recognition that their king was not the monster they had imagined, but rather a deeply damaged person who had damaged others, and that made the question of forgiveness or condemnation much more complicated. When both sides had exhausted their arguments, when no more questions remained to be asked, the council called for decision to be made by citizen vote, a radical departure from normal procedure, but appropriate for this extraordinary situation. The question was simple. Did the assembled people want Magnus to assume leadership, or did they want Theron to remain king with mandate to implement the reforms he had promised? The vote was close, far closer than Theron's supporters had hoped, but when the count was finalized, the decision was clear. Velmore wanted their broken king to have his chance at redemption, wanted to see if the promises made today could become reality tomorrow. Magnus accepted defeat with surprising grace, publicly conceding and promising to support the transition. But Chael's bond sight showed the truth, showed fury and humiliation and determination for revenge barely concealed beneath polite words, showed connections being activated, messages being sent, plans being set in motion for one final desperate move. He tried to warn Theron, but the king was surrounded by supporters, by citizens wanting to express hope or skepticism, by council members repositioning themselves for the new political landscape, and the warning got lost in the chaos of victory. That night, as Theron and Chael finally found moment alone in the royal chambers where Chael had been moved at the king's request, they should have felt relief, should have celebrated the opportunity they had won. Instead, they both felt the anticipation of storm gathering, the sense that while they had won this battle, the war for Velmore's soul was just beginning, and their enemies would not give them time to catch their breath before striking again. The attack came 3 days later during ceremony meant to officially begin the reform process, a public event where Theron would sign the first wave of new laws and policies into effect. The square was packed again, the mood celebratory, people genuinely hopeful for the first time in decades. Theron stood at the podium with Chael beside him, no longer hidden but acknowledged as the king's mate and advisor, and he was speaking about the specific changes being implemented, about protections for those with magical abilities, about review boards for sentencing, about opening borders that had been closed for too long. Then the explosion started, carefully planted charges detonating around the square's perimeter, creating panic and chaos as people stampeded toward exits. In the confusion, assassins moved toward the platform, blades drawn, and Kyle's bond sight showed him their connections, showed him that they were Magnus's people. A final desperate attempt to eliminate the king and blame it on the very magical beings Theron was trying to protect, creating martyr and justification for purge in one move. Chael did not think, did not calculate odds or consider consequences. He simply moved, throwing himself between Theron and the nearest attacker, his body taking the blade meant for the king's heart. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but so was something else. A surge of power unlike anything he had experienced before, his magical abilities activating at full strength, fueled by desperate need to protect his mate. His bond sight expanded until it encompassed the entire square, showing him every connection, every thread, and he pulled on them, used them, wove them into shield that protected the crowd from further explosions, into bindings that froze the assassins in place, into healing energy that flowed to those already injured. It was too much, far beyond what his body could sustain, and he felt something essential inside him beginning to burn out. The price of using power at this level, But he could not stop, would not stop, until everyone was safe, until Theron was safe, until he had done everything possible to protect the future they had barely begun to build. When the danger passed, when palace guards had secured, the assassins and healers were moving through crowd-treating injuries. When the immediate crisis was over, only then did Chaol let himself collapse, his body failing as the cost of what he had done caught up to him. Theron caught him before he hit the ground, gathering him close, and for the first time since Lyanna's death 23 years ago, the Alpha King wept openly, begging Chaol to hold on, promising anything, everything, if he would just survive. Elena was there instantly, her experienced hands checking vitals and assessing damage, and her expression was grave as she explained that the stab wound was serious but survivable, but that Chaol had burned through his magical reserves so completely that they might never fully recover, that he had essentially traded his abilities for their lives, and whether that trade included his own survival was still uncertain. Theron refused to accept that, refused to lose another mate to violence meant for him, and he demanded that every healer in the kingdom be brought, that every resource be dedicated to saving Chaol, that nothing else mattered until he was certain the Omega who had changed everything would survive. The vigil that followed lasted 5 days, Theron never leaving Chaol's bedside, holding his hand and talking to him constantly, sharing memories, making promises, describing the future they would build together if Chaol would just hold on. The investigation into the attack revealed exactly what Chaol's bond site had shown: Magnus's involvement. A conspiracy that included several noble houses, who preferred the old order where power was concentrated and accountability was absent. They were arrested and tried swiftly, their plots exposed, their justifications ringing hollow in the face of violence they had unleashed on innocents. Magnus himself was found dead in his cell before trial. Whether by suicide or silencing from co-conspirators remained unclear. But his death closed that chapter even as it left. Questions unanswered. Through it all, through the politics and the trials and the beginning of real reform implementation, Theron's attention remained focused on the figure in the bed, on watching for any sign of improvement, any indication that Chaol's sacrifice had not been in vain. On the 6th day, Chaol woke, his eyes opened slowly, focusing with difficulty on Theron's haggard face, and his first words, whispered and rough, were to ask if everyone was safe, if the reforms were still proceeding, if their victory had been preserved. Theron laughed and cried simultaneously, assuring him that yes, everything was fine, everything was better than fine. But none of it mattered compared to this moment, to having Chaol back. The recovery was slow, Elena warning that Chaol's magical abilities were probably gone forever, that he would never again be able to use his bond sight or healing powers the way he had before. But Chaol surprised them all, his determination to heal driving faster, progress than anyone predicted. And while his magic was indeed diminished, not gone completely, still present in small ways that let him sense emotions if not see full connections, still capable of minor healing if not the miraculous interventions he had once performed. He told Theron that he did not regret the trade, that abilities were not who he was, that he had learned he could make difference without magical powers, by simply being present, being honest, being willing to stand for what was, right even when it was difficult. If you have watched this far, if you have stayed with these characters through all their pain and growth and impossible choices, please hit that subscribe button because their story is not over, because the epilogue to this tale is going to show you exactly what a kingdom looks like when it chooses love over fear, redemption over revenge, when two people who should have been enemies instead become partners in transformation. The months that followed were marked by change both personal and political, Theron and Chaol formally bonding in ceremony that was witnessed by thousands, a public declaration that their relationship was real and chosen, not just accepted, but celebrated. The reforms continued to roll out, slowly but steadily. Protections for magical beings, review boards for sentencing, opening of borders and establishment of diplomatic relationships with kingdoms that had been isolated for decades. There was resistance, of course. Change always meets resistance. But the foundation had been laid for something different, for governance that valued all its citizens, not just those who fit narrow definitions of acceptable. Theron discovered that being vulnerable did not make him weak, that admitting mistakes did not diminish his authority but actually strengthened it, that people followed more willingly when they were asked rather than commanded. He learned to laugh again, something Cale considered personal victory every time he coaxed a genuine smile from his mate. They built a relationship that was partnership in truest sense, Cale challenging Theron when he slipped into old patterns, Theron protecting Cale from those who still feared or resented his influence, both of them working to create space where they could be themselves without the weight of expectation or the masks they had worn for survival. They were not perfect, had arguments and disagreements and moments where past traumas resurfaced and made moving forward difficult, but they faced those challenges together, committed to the work of healing individually and collectively. 5 years after that first encounter in the throne room, after that moment when an impossible bond formed between king and prisoner, Vilemore was transformed. The forbidden forests were no longer forbidden, but rather protected reserves where those with magical abilities could live openly, contributing to society rather than hiding from it. The council had been restructured to include representatives from previously marginalized groups, voices that had never been heard in government now helping to shape policy. Theron's reputation had shifted from feared tyrant to respected leader, someone who had proven that change was possible even for those who seemed irredeemable. And Cale, the Omega who should not have existed, had become symbol of hope, proof that being different was not curse but gift, that those society tried to eliminate often carried within them the very things that society needed most. They stood together on the palace balcony, watching the sun set over their kingdom, Theron's arm around Cale's waist, and they reflected on the journey that had brought them here, all the pain and possibility that had been woven into their story. Kyle said that he sometimes wondered what his life would have been if Theron's soldiers had never found him, if he had remained hidden in the forests, and Theron admitted he wondered the same thing, if he would have continued his descent into madness without the intervention of fate or destiny or whatever force had brought them together. But then Cale smiled, that particular smile that still made Theron's heart skip after all this time, and he said that he preferred not to wonder about paths not taken, preferred to focus on the road ahead, on all the work still to be done, on the future they were building together, one choice, one reform, one act of compassion at a time. And Theron, pulling his mate closer, agreed completely, because he had learned through pain and redemption that the past could not be changed, only learned from, and that the greatest power any person possessed was not the ability to dominate, but the courage to choose differently, to believe in possibility, even when reason said it was impossible, to trust in love that defied every law except the one that mattered most. The simple truth that sometimes the person who saves you is the one you never expected, the one who by all logic should not exist, but who exists anyway, impossible and perfect and exactly what you needed.